I'm Owen Bigland. This is the Inside Edge video blog. Now, if you follow me on Twitter, you saw that I posted an article a couple of days ago on the NDP government's latest harebrained idea to try and make homes and affordability for people in the city more in line to what wages are. And their latest scheme here is something called Vacancy Control. And I've had a number of people email me here and comment on my YouTube blog and talk about this. So I'm going to here. It's been a few months since I've taken a run at the NDP government, so I'm due for one anyways. And on that note, remember, as I've always said, it doesn't matter whether it's the NDPs, the Liberals, the Greens, they're all the same. The government isn't your friend. The more you can do to get yourself in a position where you don't need to rely on anything from the government, the better off you'll be, whether that's municipal, provincial, or federal. It reminds me of Kevin O'Leary, the Shark Dragon's Den host and Shark Tank. He has a reoccurring nightmare that he talks about in his book. He wakes up in cold sweats in the middle of the night, gets a phone call, and on the other end is the government saying, "Mr. O'Leary, we're from the government, we're here to help you." You want to distance yourself as much as you can from anything to do with the government. Pay your taxes and go about your business, because they are not your friend. Now, NDP, the latest thing is this vacancy control. Now, I blogged several months ago about the rental cap rollback. Just to recap it here, this is something that's worked fine for the last 30 years, where us landlords and property owners with investment properties were allowed to raise the rent every year with your tenants. It was the consumer price index, or the inflation rate, let's call it, plus 2%. So they announced it earlier this year. It was going to be a 2.5% inflation rate, because inflation has been going up, plus 2%, you were allowed a 4.5% increase. NDP government thought that was way too much of an increase and rolled it back to only the CPI. So that's 2.5%. Now, again, as I talked about a couple of months ago, this has always been the norm. No problems up until now. Now the NDP government thinks the landlords are getting too greedy. So just want to give you a quick update on that one too. The 2.5%, if you own property, if you own your principal residence, or you own an investment property, you will know that expenses have gone up far more than 2.5%. Give you an example. If you own a home, if it's your principal residence, your insurance alone has probably gone up anywhere from 25 to 35% over the last 2.5 years. Insurance rates are going up huge. I just renewed a couple of policies on a few of my investment properties last month, and I can tell you I'm looking at about a 15% increase for 2019, and that's on top of about the 15 or 18% I had for 2018. The other thing, of course, property taxes are going up much more than 2.5%. Your maintenance fees, your strata fees are up more than 2.5%. Just want to point out how ridiculous this is. And the NDP government saying that we're going to cap it at just the inflation rate at 2.5%. When we all know, if you're a property owner, your cost to hold those properties are much more than 2.5%. But it's done. I've talked about it before. I don't raise the rents on my tenants anyways. I talk about it in my book. When I have good tenants, they're not bothering me, they're taking care of the place, paying the rent on time, I leave the rent where it is, and if that happens to be for 2 or 3 or 4 years, is fine with me. I'll raise the rent when they move out back up to market. Now, this is where it gets crazy. The latest NDP harebrained idea here, which I should also tell you that probably won't pass, but let's talk about it here, is something called vacancy control. They now want to put a cap. It doesn't go with the tenant, it goes to with the house or the unit. They want to cap what the landlord is allowed to raise that rent at between tenants. So in other words, if I keep a tenant in there, like I've talked about in my book, where I've had tenants for 3 and 4 years, by the time they move out, they're paying $200, $300, $400, $500 in some cases I've had below market rent, depending on how long they've been in there. All I do is when they move out, I then raise the rent up $300 or $400 a month back up to where the market rent is. The NDP thinks I'm being too greedy there. They want to put a cap on what I'm allowed to increase my rent at between tenants, which is absolutely crazy. This is stuff that it comes out of socialist and communist governments. It really is. Now, do I think this is going to pass? It hasn't passed yet. They're talking about it. I don't think it will. Now, I had someone ask, though, Owen, if this passed, would you then raise your rents every year? And the answer to that is absolutely, I would. I would have no choice. If I was not able to raise the rents between tenants back up to where market rent was, and if that tenant was in there for 4 years, let's say, then I have no choice now but to raise the rent every single year by 2.5% or 3.5% or whatever the prescribed amount will be every year with all my tenants. I would have to send them a letter saying, due to this new crazy vacancy control tax that the NDP has implemented, I'm now going to have to make regular rent increases annually to your rent. I would have no choice because I would never be able to get the rent anywhere near market. I would lose money after 5 or 6 years on it. I'd be collecting far less than what the market rate is. But this is just another example of how out of tune the NDP government is with this. They have no idea what individual landlords and the amount of housing that they provide for this city. Without the individual landlord and without the larger landlords, rents would be far more expensive. And why I don't think it's going to pass, there was an article in the Vancouver Sun and in the Globe and Mail talking about if this ever did, there's currently 12,000 rental units, the developer, rental-only buildings that are under the planning stages now. According to the Globe and Mail and Vancouver Sun, you can forget those. Those developers will walk away from those if they have a vacancy control limitation on what they can charge between tenant moves. I can tell you just one step better than that. I can tell you that already a lot of the rental buildings that were planned in the next few years by some of the developers are already been put on the sideline just because of that rental increase rollback to 2.5% instead of 4.5%. There's no incentive there for developers to get involved in building rental housing, especially if you add something like this. I've talked about it quite a few times before. We have not had rental-only buildings built in this city for decades now. And the only reason that lately, over the last 3 or 4 years, we're finally getting some new rental stock being built by developers is because the city of Vancouver has been giving them some incredible incentives. You build us a 10-story or a 15-story rental building, we will give you much more FSR, floor space ratio, much quicker zoning and green lighting on your other projects. Because I've talked about it many times, developers, they want to build strata. They want to pre-sell them, build the building, get the rest of the deposits in place, and move on to the next project. Get their money and make their money and move on. Rental buildings, of course, are a much longer process. It's taking them 20, 30, 40 years to get their money. So they're still interested in it if they can get some proper incentives on it. But for the most part, they want to build condos, stratified condo. Now, this vacancy control will just put the final nail in the coffin to that. You better believe it. Now, I don't think it's going to pass. As I say, I thought I would talk about it here just to show you how out of tune the NDP government is with this kind of thing. This vacancy control will not do anything to affordability. As a matter of fact, for rental affordability, as a matter of fact, it would make the situation far worse because, again, it would completely put an axe down on any future rental buildings being put in. And I already think that that's already happened. There's already a bunch that are under construction that have come on or coming online over the next 18 months. Too late to stop those. But I think with this rental rollback that they did, that's already pretty much put the kibosh on any future rental development buildings that developers are going to want to get involved in. But hey, the final thing I'll tell people is don't worry about it. I sure don't. I'm not losing any sleep over this. I never do with anything with the government. Governments come and go. They always do. Legislation comes, it goes. It'll be a few more years before this current NDP government will get booted out, which they will. And we will probably get the back to normal on the rent increases, where it's the CPI plus 2%, which is fair. Hardly gouging anyone on that. The landlords, as they say, the landlords' costs and expenses are going up far more than 4.5% on average. So a couple more years, that'll be gone, and we'll go back to the regular inflation rate plus 2%. The vacancy control, I think, is a non-starter. Even if it did get approved, again, it'll last a couple of years till the next government comes in, and then it'll be eliminated. So don't lose sleep over it if you're a landlord. And again, if the vacancy control did come in, I think probably the majority of my investment clients, not all of them, but the majority kind of work the same way I do. If they get a good tenant, they tend not to raise the rent every year. Some of my clients do. And there's no right or wrong to it. But I think if this vacancy control did come in, I can guarantee 100% of all my investment clients would raise the rent every single year. You'd have to. You'd have no other choice if you had a vacancy control tax in place or cap in place. I'm Owen Bigland. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.